Sometimes the most enduring lines on the world map were drawn not by victors or heroes, but by people who, under normal circumstances, would have preferred not to even be in the same room. Moreover, sometimes these lines were born not from plans of conquest, but from almost accidental agreements struck between enemies who hated each other so much that the only common language they shared was the language of calculation. And the strangest thing here is not that enemies came to an agreement, but how far-reaching the consequences of those agreements turned out to be. We're used to thinking that world maps are redrawn by wars, by tanks, armies, and flags flying over capitals. The victor takes the territory, the loser vanishes from the map. Simple logic, almost childlike in its clarity. But history constantly pretends to obey this logic and then quietly breaks it. Because sometimes wars merely formalize what has already been decided behind closed doors, in negotiations where the word enemy suddenly ceases to stand in the way of the word deal. And this is where what textbooks usually don't mention begins, not because it's a secret, but because it's too inconvenient. Let's imagine the familiar picture of the world. Empires clash, armies march, ideologies collide head-on. History looks like a giant arena where strength decides everything. But if you look more closely, you'll notice a strange detail. Sometimes the most bitter conflicts end as if someone had drawn their boundaries in advance, as if war were not chaos but a tool that simply brings an existing agreement to its conclusion. And then an uncomfortable question arises. What if key decisions are not made on the battlefield but before it? One of the most striking examples of this strange logic was early 20th century Europe, a world that looked like a boiling cauldron of ideologies and national ambitions was in fact also a space of hidden agreements, where enemies managed to carve out each other's futures even before the first shots were fired. One such episode was an agreement that outwardly appeared to be a diplomatic truce between irreconcilable adversaries, but in reality became a mechanism for redistributing entire regions. The essence of such arrangements is simple and almost cynical. If conflict is inevitable, it is better to determine its outcome in advance and minimize losses, not of people, no, but of resources, influence, and time. And this is precisely where the first crack appears in the familiar picture of the world, because enemies suddenly begin to behave not like enemies, but like partners in a very cold, very calculating business. Take Europe in 1939. On one side, ideological adversaries publicly declaring their mutual hatred. On the other, a deal is being struck under the table that effectively divides Eastern Europe into spheres of influence.
And this doesn't look like friendship. It looks like the accounting of a disaster. Borders, cities, countries, everything becomes a line item in a document where efficiency, not emotions, is the priority. And here the first paradox arises. The more intense the public hostility, the more pragmatic the secret agreements can be, because public hatred often hides a surprisingly cold calculation behind closed doors. But this is only the beginning. If we look further back in history, it becomes clear that this logic repeats itself over and over again.
The Napoleonic era. Wars that seem like an endless clash between Europe and a man trying to rewrite its rules. And then suddenly, a moment when the empire's enemies sit down at the negotiating table and effectively acknowledge the new political reality, redistributing influence as if the war were already over, even though it continues. And once again, the same pattern. It is not victory that determines the treaty. Rather, the treaty pushes victory in the desired direction. Time passes, and this logic does not disappear. It simply changes form. The 20th century transforms it into an art form.
Because a new reality is emerging, a global one. Now any mistake on one continent can upset the balance on another. and enemies are beginning to realize something strange. Sometimes it is more advantageous not to destroy the enemy, but to negotiate with them regarding the terms of their existence. This is how agreements emerge that formally look like diplomatic moves, but in essence are an attempt to divide the world without a final war. It is precisely at such moments that history becomes particularly paradoxical, because publicly the world speaks of morality, ideals, and principles, but behind the scenes it discusses kilometers of borders, access to resources, and spheres of influence. And the further this logic develops, the more the line between victory and compromise blurs. Sometimes a country wins a war, but loses the negotiations. Sometimes the opposite is true. The losing side retains its influence precisely because it sat down at the negotiating table with the enemy at the right moment. And this is where the fundamental shift in perception gradually takes shape. We begin to understand that the map of the world is not the result of conflicts. It is the result of compromises made against the backdrop of those conflicts. But the most interesting thing happens when an element of chance enters the picture. Because by no means were all these deals the result of a carefully thought-out strategy. Some of them arose almost spontaneously, out of fear, fatigue, lack of time, or even a simple misunderstanding. And it was these accidental agreements that proved to be the most enduring. Because history has a strange quality. It doesn't enshrine perfect solutions, but rather those that were made at the right moment. The tension builds precisely here because it becomes clear the map of the world could have looked different. Completely different. All it would have taken was a different wording, a different signature, a different pause in the conversation. But the signature is already there, and the consequences are already set in motion. And at some point, all these scattered examples come together to form a single pattern. From the imperial treaties of the 19th century to the secret agreements of the 20th century and modern geopolitical compromises, the same principle repeats itself. Enemies may hate one another, but they can still jointly shape the future. And the closer we get to the heart of the matter, the clearer a strange thing becomes. The world does not change when someone wins. It changes when enemies agree to limit the very possibility of victory. And now we can see the final twist in this story. That very chance deal between enemies that reshaped the world map was almost never a coincidence in the literal sense. It was coincidental only in terms of its consequences. Because at the moment it was signed, it seemed like a temporary solution, a compromise, a pause, an attempt to buy time. But it is precisely these kinds of decisions that turn out to be the strongest, because they don't just capture the current reality, they create a new one. And sometimes a single signature placed between two enemies accomplishes more than years of war. Not because it is just, but because it turns out to be more convenient than the alternative. And here, the whole story boils down to a simple, almost cold thought. A map of the world is not a record of victories. This is the legacy of agreements reached at a time when victory had become too costly, too dangerous, or too uncertain. And that is precisely why history's most important decisions were often made not on the battlefield, but in rooms where enemies first ceased to behave like enemies. And in the end, a strange sense of clarity remains. A world that seems built on conflict is actually held together by those rare moments when conflict temporarily receded, for the sake of a deal.